Hollywood has always been good at two things: creating legends, and destroying them. The golden age of cinema gave us gods and goddesses, men and women so dazzling that the whole world stopped breathing just to watch them. But behind every spotlight, there was a shadow. And for some of the most brilliant, most talented, most beloved stars to ever grace the silver screen, the end wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even dignified. It was silent. It was lonely. It was broke. These were Jewish men and women who built Hollywood with their bare hands, who shaped American culture, who made millions of people laugh and cry and fall in love, and yet somehow, the industry they helped create chewed them up and spat them out without a second thought. What you're about to hear isn't just a story about money. It's a story about betrayal, about heartbreak, about an industry with no memory and no mercy. And the first name on this list, it's going to break your heart. Fanny Brice. She was the most famous comedienne in America, and almost nobody under 50 knows her name today. Fanny Brice was born in 1891 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the daughter of Jewish immigrants who could barely keep the lights on. From the time she was a little girl, she had a gift, a raw, explosive, uncontrollable gift for making people laugh. She taught herself everything. She snuck into vaudeville theaters, she watched, she imitated, she practiced until her feet bled and her voice gave out. By the time she was a teenager, she was performing on real stages. By the time she was in her 20s, she was a Ziegfeld Follies star. The whole country knew her name. Florenz Ziegfeld himself said she was one of the greatest natural performers he had ever seen. And he had seen everyone. But Fanny had a weakness that Hollywood couldn't fix and fame couldn't cure: she fell in love with the wrong man. Nicky Arnstein was charming and handsome and completely reckless with other people's money. He drained her finances, humiliated her publicly, and eventually landed in prison for securities fraud. Fanny paid his legal bills. She paid everything. Fans had no idea what was really happening behind that enormous smile. She kept performing, kept making people laugh, kept pouring everything she had into a career that slowly began to shrink around her. Radio gave her Baby Snooks, a beloved character that kept her relevant for a while, but by the late 1940s, the world was changing and Fanny was aging and the contracts stopped coming. She died in 1951 with her finances in quiet ruin, her name already beginning to fade. She deserved a monument. She got a footnote. John Garfield. There are actors who are good. There are actors who are great. And then there was John Garfield, a man who burned so hot and so bright that Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. Born Jacob Julius Garfinkel in 1913 in the Bronx, he grew up in poverty so raw it left permanent marks on everything he ever did on screen. You could see it in his eyes. That hunger. That barely contained rage. That look of a man who had fought for every single thing he ever had. He came up through the group theater, trained alongside some of the most serious actors of his generation, and when he finally hit Hollywood, he exploded. His performances in films like Body and Soul and Force of Evil were so visceral, so electrifying, that audiences couldn't look away. He was the original method actor. Brando came after. But behind the cameras, the truth was darker. Garfield was a man of deep political convictions. He had grown up poor. He believed in workers' rights, in equality, in things that made him deeply suspicious to the political climate of post-war America. When the House Un-American Activities Committee came for Hollywood, they came for John Garfield too. He was called before the committee. He refused to name names. He refused to betray his friends. And Hollywood, that place he had given everything to, turned its back on him entirely. The blacklist destroyed his career almost overnight. The roles stopped. The money stopped. The stress of fighting to clear his name, of watching his reputation be systematically dismantled, broke something inside him. John Garfield died of a heart attack in 1952. He was 39 years old. 39. Some people said it was the witch hunt that killed him. Looking at the evidence, it's very hard to argue otherwise. Lou Tellegen, wait. Before we go further, the next story on this list involves a man whose name you might recognize from one single famous film, but whose real life was a tragedy so complete, so devastating, that it rewrites everything you thought you knew about success in Hollywood. Harry Langdon. Once upon a time, Harry Langdon was as famous as Charlie Chaplin. That sentence sounds impossible today, but in 1926, it was simply true. Langdon was born in Council Bluffs, Iowa in 1884, and by the time he reached Hollywood, he had spent decades mastering the art of performance in vaudeville and traveling medicine shows. His character, this strange, childlike, wide-eyed innocent lost in a world that made no sense, was unlike anything audiences had seen before. His Jewish heritage, his outsider perspective, his deeply felt sense of being always slightly out of place in the world, it all poured into his performances in a way that felt completely unique. Frank Capra, who directed some of his greatest films, later said that Langdon had a genius for stillness, for doing almost nothing and communicating everything. Films like Tramp 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 and The Strong Man made him a genuine star. The studio put him on par with Keaton and Lloyd. And then Harry Langdon made the worst decision of his career, he fired Frank Capra and decided to direct himself. What happened next shocked Hollywood. Without Capra's disciplined storytelling to shape his peculiar gifts, Langdon's films became self-indulgent and confused. The audiences drifted away. The studio dropped him. He tried to reinvent himself in sound pictures, but his unique silent persona didn't translate. He spent the rest of his life chasing the ghost of his own greatness, working in small shorts and bit parts for studios that once would have begged for his name on a marquee. He died in 1944, nearly penniless, in a rented apartment in Los Angeles. The man who had once been called the fourth genius of silent comedy died with almost nothing. Hollywood had already moved on before he was even buried. SYLVIA SIDNEY. She had the saddest eyes in Hollywood, and that wasn't an accident. SYLVIA SIDNEY, born Sophia Koso in 1910 to Jewish parents in New York City, carried something in her face that no acting coach could teach. A depth. A grief. A profound sense of feeling everything just a little more than everyone else. Paramount Pictures signed her early and marketed her as a serious dramatic actress, and she delivered, film after film after film of raw, unguarded emotional power. She worked with directors like Alfred Hitchcock and Fritz Lang. She starred opposite the biggest leading men of her era. She was nominated for awards, praised by critics, loved by audiences. But SYLVIA SIDNEY was not interested in being what Hollywood wanted her to be. She pushed back against contracts she found exploitative. She fought for roles that had substance and meaning rather than just glamour. And in the Hollywood of the 1930s, a woman who pushed back was a woman who got punished. The studio began loaning her out to lesser productions, burying her in material that didn't suit her, wearing her down deliberately until she walked away from her contract entirely. Fans had no idea what was really happening. She tried Broadway. She tried television. She worked constantly because she had to, not because the offers were good. Her personal life brought its own turbulent storms, marriages that collapsed, financial decisions that didn't pan out, years of simply treading water in an industry that had decided she was yesterday's news. By the time she found a genuine late-career resurgence in films like Beetlejuice in 1988, she was in her late 70s, and the industry treated her appearance as a charming rediscovery rather than a long-overdue recognition of someone they had discarded decades too early. She deserved so much more than a charming rediscovery. Edward G. Robinson. Here is a name most people still recognize. But the full story, the real story, almost nobody knows. Emanuel Goldenberg was born in Bucharest, Romania in 1893 and arrived in America as a young Jewish immigrant who could barely speak English. He taught himself the language. He worked. He scratched. He clawed his way into acting and transformed himself so completely into Edward G. Robinson that the original name almost disappeared entirely. His performance as Rico in Little Caesar in 1931 launched the entire gangster genre. He was magnetic, terrifying, funny, heartbreaking, sometimes all in the same scene. He collected fine art. He built a collection worth millions. He spoke 7 languages. He was considered one of the most cultured, most intelligent men in Hollywood. But culture and intelligence were no protection when the Red Scare arrived. Robinson had been involved with various liberal causes throughout his career, causes that, in the poisoned atmosphere of the early 1950s, were suddenly being called something much more sinister. He was named in testimony before WAC. He wasn't blacklisted formally, but the damage was done. To save his career, he eventually made the painful, humiliating decision to appear before the committee and cooperate. It cost him something he never fully recovered, his own self-respect. To pay mounting legal bills and debts accumulated during the years of professional uncertainty, he was forced to sell his beloved art collection. Paintings he had spent a lifetime gathering, works he had loved with his whole heart, auctioned off to cover expenses. He spent his final years working steadily but quietly, never quite returning to the heights he had once occupied. He died in 1973, just days after finally receiving an honorary Academy Award, a lifetime achievement honor they had somehow never found the time to give him while he was still healthy enough to fully enjoy it. Mae Murray. They called her the girl with the bee-stung lips, and for a moment in the 1920s, that face was literally everywhere. Mae Murray was born Marie Adrienne Koenig in 1885 in Portsmouth, Virginia, the daughter of Jewish Austrian immigrants, and she arrived in Hollywood with a dancer's body and an iron will and an absolute certainty that she was destined for immortality. She wasn't wrong, for a while. Her silent film career was spectacular. She radiated a kind of dangerous glamour that audiences couldn't resist. MGM put her in elaborate productions, surrounded her with luxury, and promoted her as one of the great stars of the age. She starred in The Merry Widow in 1925 and delivered a performance of such reckless, joyful sensuality that critics ran out of superlatives. But behind the cameras, the truth was darker. Murray had married a man named Prince David Mdivani, a Georgian nobleman of deeply questionable authenticity who was almost certainly more interested in her money than in her. He systematically isolated her from studio executives, inserted himself into her professional decisions, fought publicly with Louis B. Mayer, and essentially got her fired from MGM on her own behalf. The marriage ended. The career was already rubble. Sound pictures came and Mae Murray's particular brand of silent-era magnetism didn't translate cleanly into the new format. She tried. She kept trying for years. But the industry had moved on and no one called. By the 1950s, she was wandering the streets of New York in a haze of denial, wearing old movie star clothes, telling anyone who would listen about her glory days. She was found on a park bench more than once. She died in a Missouri nursing home in 1965, almost completely penniless, her estate worth less than $2,000. $2,000, for a woman who had once been worth millions. Mabel Normand. The name Mabel Normand should be spoken alongside Chaplin and Keaton and Lloyd. It isn't, and that silence is its own kind of injustice. Born in 1892, Mabel came from a working-class family with Jewish roots on her mother's side, and she entered the film business almost by accident, discovering quickly that she had a gift for physical comedy that was completely without precedent for a woman of her era. She worked alongside Chaplin at Keystone, and historians who've examined the records carefully believe she directed some of their early films together, though she never received credit. She was brilliant. She was fearless. She did her own stunts. She invented comedic bits that other performers copied for decades. But Mabel's life off-screen was chaotic in ways that the tabloids of her era were only too happy to magnify. She was linked romantically to director William Desmond Taylor, who was found murdered in 1922 in a case that was never solved. Mabel's name was dragged through every headline. Then one of her chauffeurs shot a man at a party using her gun. She was never charged with anything. She never did anything wrong. But the whiff of scandal was enough. Studios backed away. Audiences who had loved her began to feel uncertain. She kept working, kept fighting, kept trying to remind the world of who she was. And this was only the beginning of her suffering. Tuberculosis had been quietly destroying her body for years. She died in 1930 at just 37 years old, her career already in ruins, her savings largely gone to medical bills. One of the founding geniuses of film comedy, gone at 37, and mostly forgotten within a generation. Samuel ORNITZ. Most people have never heard this name. That absence is exactly the story. Samuel ORNITZ was a Jewish writer from the Lower East Side of New York who arrived in Hollywood in the 1930s and brought with him a fierce social conscience, a novelist's gift for character, and a lifelong commitment to the idea that storytelling could change the world. He wrote screenplays. He was good at it. He was part of a generation of talented, politically engaged Jewish writers who gave Hollywood some of its most enduring stories. But Samuel ORNITZ was also a communist, openly, unapologetically, and when the House Un-American Activities Committee convened its most famous Hollywood hearings in 1947, ORNITZ was one of the 10 who refused to cooperate. The Hollywood 10. He went to prison for contempt of Congress. He served time. He was blacklisted completely from the industry upon his release, his name essentially radioactive in every studio in Los Angeles. He tried to write under pseudonyms. He tried to find work through intermediaries. The walls closed in on every side. He spent the final years of his life in poverty and poor health, isolated from the industry he had served, watching writers with half his talent earn money he would never see again. He died in 1957 with almost nothing. His crime was refusing to betray his friends. His punishment was the erasure of everything he had worked to build. Hollywood never apologized. It rarely does. Lou Tellegen. And finally, a story so complete in its tragedy, so absolute in its devastation, that it almost doesn't feel real. Lou Tellegen was born in 1881 in the Netherlands, the son of a Jewish merchant, and he arrived in America as a staggeringly handsome stage actor who had been the personal companion and leading man of the legendary Sarah Bernhardt herself. He came to Hollywood when the movies were still silent and young and hungry for European sophistication, and for a moment he had everything: fame, beauty, money, the adoration of audiences who found him impossibly glamorous. He married opera star Geraldine Farrar in a union that was as spectacular and turbulent as anything Hollywood could invent. But Tellegen had no real understanding of money, no ability to manage the financial realities behind the glamour. As he aged and the roles dried up, he found himself utterly unprepared for obscurity. The beauty that had been his calling card faded. The industry forgot him almost instantly. He was reduced to taking bit parts, then no parts at all. He wrote a memoir that he hoped might revive interest in his story. It didn't. By 1934, Lou Tellegen was living alone in a small apartment in Los Angeles, his health broken, his bank account empty, his name meaningful to almost no one still working in the industry he had once graced. On October 29 of that year, he died by his own hand, surrounded, it was reported, by old photographs and press clippings from the days when the whole world had known his name. It is the most heartbreaking image in all of Hollywood history. A man sitting alone with the ghost of his own greatness. Hollywood is very good at myths. It builds them carefully, tends them devotedly, and sells them to the world with a smile. But the myth and the truth have always lived in separate rooms. These men and women, Jewish sons and daughters of immigrants, of working-class families, of a people who understood in their bones what it meant to be an outsider, they didn't just work in Hollywood. They built it. They shaped it. They poured their genius and their pain and their whole selves into an art form that the whole world came to love. And the whole world watched their faces on screens the size of buildings, and then forgot their names almost before the projectors cooled. That's the real story of the Golden Age. Not the gowns and the galas and the glamour. The real story is the people who gave everything and received, in the end, almost nothing in return. Remember their names. They more than earned that much. If this story moved you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, subscribe. Because every week, we go back to find the ones history left behind.